I'm going to review some of the context and the research that was done in Wake County regarding math placement. And I want to start with a little bit of context. I think we started working with the school counselors around 2006, and in 2009 we were still working on the issue of how do you get kids into math placement. And here, this is a graph of 7 schools in Wake County and the percent of the students who scored level 4 on their 7th grade standardized test that were then placed in 8th grade algebra by teacher recommendation. And you see how much it varies by school. And we analyzed this data to working with the school counselors just to show how inconsistent the policies were, or at least they were inconsistent with past achievement. Actually, not the policies, there were no policies. And then we also looked by race for the district as a whole and saw that the teacher recommendations for placement in 8th grade algebra were racially biased. Now, nobody probably intended overtly to be racially biased. It's just that's how the data shook out. And you can see it was 19% of the black males who scored at the highest possible level on their 7th grade EOG were recommended by a teacher for 8th grade algebra. I think the lowest percentage was Hispanic females. And then we started looking at why this was happening, and we saw that it was actually happening all over the United States. It was nothing unique to Wake County schools. Then the task force that was headed by the school counselors in Wake County, the administrators of school counseling, we met for several years to discuss how we might get to the point where we have objective criteria. I don't remember how many years it was, but it was like maybe 4 years. So keep in mind that the context for this was that there was no objective criteria being used for placement in the advanced math track, which at that time, 8th grade algebra was the big indicator that you were headed into the advanced math track in high school. And there was no objective criteria for how students got placed there. And there were many very high scoring, low income and minority students who were not being recommended. And the data showed that there was a greater proportion, it was more difficult for them to be recommended by teacher recommendation, and you couldn't earn your way in. So that's what the math placement was about. It was not about lowering any criteria. It was about giving access to students who had already demonstrated advanced academic success in math. Then for additional context, in 2009, SAS put together a report for every district in North Carolina telling them how many students were predicted by EVAS to be successful in 8th grade algebra and whether or not those students were enrolled in 8th grade algebra. And this was Wake County's report. 42% of those predicted by EVAS with the 70% threshold were actually being enrolled, and 58% who met that threshold were not enrolled. And this study was done in 2009. It was the 2008, 2009 7th graders that they looked at. This shows the distribution of the projections for Wake County. And these reports were given at a superintendent conference that was led by the North Carolina Association of School Superintendents. Bill McNeil was in charge of it at the time. He was their head. And the districts all got these. Wake County, that's a large percentage in the green. And SAS chose the 70% because that's what the data showed. There was a cut there. When you cut at 70%, 98% of the students who took algebra who had been predicted at the 70% line were successful. So they recommended that. 2% were not successful, but you don't know who those 2% are. So that's why they put the cut threshold at 70%. So this went on for several years, and EdStar Analytics kept working with school districts to help them use their data for many things, including if they wanted to use it for math placement. At one point, Wake County was going to have objective criteria of EOG scores, And they did for a while, and then they didn't, and some of the schools didn't know about it. It kind of fell apart. And then with the ED task force, an actual policy was written, and they decided to use 70 as a threshold. And some researchers that they were collaborating with from Harvard did some studies on the math placement. And the first presentation was done in 2013. And here are some excerpts from that presentation. Daryl Hill was working in Wake County schools as part of a collaborative research effort between Harvard and Wake County schools. Notice the name of this presentation is Getting to Algebra for All, Preliminary Evidence of a Middle School Math Acceleration Policy. Now, everybody already takes algebra. It's required for graduation. And they already offered accelerated middle school math. It's been offered for decades. What was different was they were going to have objective criteria, so high-scoring, low-income, and minorities could also get into the middle school accelerated classes, even if they didn't have a teacher recommendation. So that may be one reason people were confused as to what was going on, because it's kind of a confusing title for that situation. Another thing that might confuse people in trying to understand what actually went on or what the evidence is, the motivation for this research. And I think only one research study was done, but more than one paper was written on it. But in this presentation here, which was the first one on the study, their motivation includes the third bullet there, Algebra for All has become popular and implemented. Well, we're not talking about algebra for all. Keep in mind, we're talking about having objective criteria so that equally high-scoring students who are historically overlooked when teacher recommendations are used don't have access to advanced middle school math, which is the gateway to advanced math in high school. And see the fourth bullet there, existing evidence on impact of math achievement and algebra for all is mixed. Once again, we're not talking about algebra for all, so why is that a motivation? And the last one, some districts and states have made policy shifts as a result of negative outcomes. Now, what is confusing is that what Wake County did was go from having no objective criteria and teacher recommendation only for access to the advanced math track in 8th grade algebra versus having objective criteria. So it's confusing that these things are listed as the motivation for the research.
I have a question about looking at the 70, a couple things. Calling this what's happened in Wake County as far as having an EVAS criteria for math placement, I don't consider that acceleration, because we're having criteria instead of not having criteria. And we've always had students taking algebra all over the whole range of ability, and we're not accelerating that. We're not accelerating access to algebra. What we did was we drew a line, and if you met that criteria, you could take algebra. But we've always had kids in the whole spectrum taking algebra, so it seems kind of not right to call this acceleration. But let me say one other thing. SAS has done statewide studies, rigorous studies, and a lot of studies about what should you expect when you draw the line at different places. And they tell the conditions under which you should expect what they predict. And I'm wondering, did you look at the SASA studies to see what did they predict should happen if you draw the line at 70? And what conditions should you be looking for in order to get the results that SAS?
Okay, well, to your first point, Janet, I think that what you see in the research is that typically Algebra 1 is a 9th grade course. And so what
Algebra 1 has been in 8th grade for...
I understand in Wake County that that's true, but
it's true in the whole United States.
Nationwide.
Well, if you look at, for example, the work that was done in Chicago, we've talked about.
That was algebra for everybody, not
right.
Algebra for some.
It was algebra for everyone in the 9th grade. And so, when you hear the discourse about students taking algebra, that's why we're referring to it as an acceleration. Whether or not we've done it here and whether it's popular across the country.
So you're looking at whether anyone should take algebra in 8th grade?
No. No.
So I'm sorry, I'm not understanding that.
What I'm saying is, in response to your first point, where you said that algebra is common for 8th graders, what I'm saying is that if you're looking across the country at the samples and the conversation and the discourse, Algebra 1 is typically for a 9th grade student. So the majority of students who are taking Algebra 1 are taking it in high school. There are a good number of kids, a large number of kids who are taking it in 8th grade and earlier. We're not trying to limit who is taking it. That has nothing to do with the analysis that we've done. That was just in response to your first point.
So your research question is, should we teach algebra in 8th grade?
No.
Can we?
No.
Maybe it would be better if we all start on the same page, because I don't, you weren't here during the ED task force,
Right.
and then, the ED task force was done away with, and we really haven't had a forum to have these discussions and to have stakeholders be involved in conversations and have a give and take like we used to have. And so maybe it would be better to give you some perspective of perhaps why Janet's asking these questions and why we're here in the first place.
And I'm happy to have that dialogue.
Yeah, long story short, and the perspective is always going to be different from who you hear it from, but there was a clear gateway to acceleration in Wake County, and it was 8th grade algebra. And when we looked across subgroups of children, disproportionately, we found that minority children and economically disadvantaged children were, even though they were qualified, they were not being placed in 8th grade algebra, which is our acceleration pathway, right? That's the way that our math courses track in Wake County. We use tracking. For better, for worse, we use tracking. And our minority children and our economically disadvantaged children were not being placed on this accelerated track.
Right.
So that's where EVOS came into the discussion. And actually, instead of using demographics to make decision about math placement, we, as a county, the stakeholders in the county, asked for data-driven decision-making. And there was a lot of discussion, and finally Wake County agreed to use data, all right? And we decided that we were going to use that 70% probability because there was a substantial amount of data surrounding that cutoff, and that was statewide.
Mm-hmm. But we didn't know if we had the resources that are SAS lays out clearly to expect what they predict. If you draw the line at 70, you need to have this set of resources. And to my knowledge, we never did an inventory to see if we had those resources.
We didn't get that far because then the ED task force was dissolved and the issue came off the table for the community. And we never got that far in saying, okay, now that we've said we're using data-driven math placement criteria, what are we doing to support children?
Questions around the 70% probability, the EVOS probability that was used to accelerate students. And so this aspect of the presentation is looking at the 70% probability cutoff and some very preliminary conclusions they're conclusions, but they're very preliminary outcomes. And we're looking at the effects of student achievement on the end of grade exam for 6th, 7th, and 8th grade students, okay? So when you look at this particular chart, we're on 10 of 14, Lindsay.
Yep.
What we're seeing is that there is a deficiency in performance for students who are Black and Hispanic and female who are just above the 70% cutoff in comparison to their peers who are just below the 70% cutoff. And so if you look at the second, third, and fourth tables, if you're looking 2, 3, and 4, the columns 2, 3, and 4, you see that the first is all grades put together. It's pooled across the sample. Then in 2, we just look at grade 6. 3, we're looking at grade 7, and 4, we're looking at grade 8. And so what you see is that there's negative effects, slightly negative effects in grade 6, in grade 7, and then substantive negative effects in grade 8. And so that is, in a nutshell, how we came to those conclusions and how we started the work.
So they explain their research, and it's a fuzzy regression discontinuity design because what they're looking for is to verify that the 70 is a good threshold, but there are students with scores below 70 in algebra and above 70 not in algebra, and that's what makes it fuzzy. So what they're looking at is 70 a good cut, basically. SAS had already looked at that, so I guess they're looking to see, SAS looked at statewide data when they recommended 70. So it looks like they're either looking to replicate SAS's study or see if what was true for the state as a whole is also true for Wake County. But although that's what they're doing, that doesn't really mix with what they list as the motivation and the title. And so I think this leads to some of the confusion people have. Here's an excerpt from the meeting with Daryl Hill explaining this table in the presentation.
There is a deficiency in performance for students who are Black and Hispanic and female who are just above the 70% cutoff in comparison to their peers who are just below the 70% cutoff. And so if you look at the second, third, and fourth tables, if you're looking 2, 3, and 4, the columns 2, 3, and 4, you see that the first is all grades put together. It's pooled across the sample. Then in 2, we just look at grade 6. 3, we're looking at grade 7, and 4, we're looking at grade 8. And so what you see is that there's negative effects, slightly negative effects in grade 6 and grade 7. And then substantive negative effects in grade 8. And so that is, in a nutshell, how we came to those conclusions and how we started the work.
So here's what they reported as the implications of what they learned from their research study. And if you remember, their research study was looking at whether or not the 70 threshold was a good threshold. But they say that what they found, or what they can imply, we provide tentative evidence of negative but noisy impacts of middle school math acceleration on short-term measures of student achievement. Now think about inferring that from this study. And the achievement of 6th graders was most affected, particularly female, Black, and Hispanic students. Now they forget to qualify that as female, Black, and Hispanic students who barely made the cut. They didn't look at the ones who were way above the line. And then they also say that these populations are already known to be vulnerable. So from this, you might infer that this policy of objective math placement has a negative effect on female, Black, and Hispanic students. Some people might, and other people might be confused. And some people might realize this study really doesn't have anything to do with having objective math placement. Now, this is a presentation on the same research study. The other one was given at a national conference, and then it was given and discussed to a stakeholder community group. This is a different presentation explaining the same study. This one was given to the Board of Education Student Achievement Committee in Wake County. This is from page 4 of his presentation. And this is like a literature review, but notice that the literature that's being cited is all kind of cautioning against middle school math placement. Misplaced students sometimes function several grade levels below their counterparts. When universally offered, accelerated students scored lower on end of grade. And this is all irrelevant to looking at whether or not 70 is a good cut. It's also irrelevant to looking at whether or not there should be objective math placement criteria so that equally high-scoring minority students have access to the courses. And this is a slide from the presentation that was to the school board committee. And note that I think this is one of the reasons people get confused. It says district chose targeted, not universal intervention. So they're calling having objective criteria targeted intervention. And I think that might confuse some people because targeted intervention usually has a different meaning than having a cut score or allowing access with objective criteria. So they are calling that targeted intervention. And see, this is slide 6 from the presentation. And see how their quantitative investigation shows that they are analyzing the 70% cutoff. So they're going to give descriptive statistics relating to taking advanced math courses and passing EOG for enrollment and analyzing the 70% cutoff to see if it's a decent cutoff. And I think some people, although they don't say this here, I think that some people assumed the cutoff was being lowered to 70%, when in fact they're having a cutoff for the first time instead of teacher recommendations only. This is from a SAS presentation, just to show what they had already done the analyses to see for the students who score between the 70 and 100% probability range. Statewide, I was wrong earlier, it's 95.9% of them scored a level 3 or 4 on their Algebra 1 EOC when they took Algebra 1. And so that's why SAS chose the 70. It's a lot of kids. Now this presentation also included information about the Wake Forest Roseville Middle School, as if they were the first adopters. EdStar was working with Wake Forest Roseville Middle School. We worked with them for 3 years as we were hired by the Professional Development Department to work with the schools with the largest achievement gaps. And we helped them use EVOS to identify students who were overlooked by teacher recommendations. In the second year, the first year we worked with them, they only moved in the kids who were gifted and predicted. And it was a small group because most of the gifted kids were already in algebra. Then the second year, it's like they had an aha wake-up year, and they looked at all the kids who were predicted at 70% or above, and it was way too many kids, is what the principal said, which would have been too much of an all-at-once culture shock. So they did not move in all the kids that were predicted at the 70% threshold. They moved the kids with 80% or above, and it was 50 students. But these researchers didn't know that. So they used in their presentation to the school board, they used Wake Forest Roseville following the wrong set of kids longitudinally as evidence that the success was short term. There were 25 kids already in 8th grade algebra with teacher recommendations. We don't know what their EVOS scores were. The principal, Elaine Hanser, moved in an additional 50 who were predicted at the 80% or higher level. But these researchers went back and looked at data for all the students who had scored at the 70% threshold, and they assumed they had taken Algebra 1, and they followed them longitudinally through high school and saw that that group, where half those kids didn't take 8th grade algebra, that group, a lot of them were not taking advanced math in high school, which is to be expected because they didn't get on that track. But anyway, this was included in their presentation, and it has been cited as evidence that success is short term. So I don't even really know how to interpret this slide, but this is one of many slides that were in this presentation that aim to show that the students who were placed into 8th grade algebra using EVOS at Wake Forest Roseville Middle School were not successful later. But these are courses. They didn't have 160 kids in 8th grade algebra. They had 25, and they moved 50 in, so they had 75 kids. But 160 kids got followed. I don't know what calculus is after 12th. I mean, I don't know how to understand this, but whatever this graph is trying to convey, I don't think it's accurate. So there were a couple research papers published. This one, and let's see. So this paper was published, presentations at national conferences to school board committees, to community stakeholders, and they were all on the same research. They did change the way they were presenting it, but a lot of people became confused and would cite this research study as evidence that the math placement policy was not a good idea. Now, the legislation does not use the EVOS prediction. They use the standardized test scores, and they also are not just about 8th grade algebra or middle school math. It is about any math class that's the most rigorous math class, and students with the highest possible scores having access to those. So that's a different issue. I mean, it's really trying to address the same issue, but it would be a different data set that you would need to look at. There's a problem with elementary school in that the course codes are all the same. So it's hard to have accountability because you don't know, you can't run a report and find out who's in the most advanced courses. The same thing is true up to 8th grade algebra. You can't even tell who's in pre-algebra from running a report. You just have to look at who the teacher was. I mean, it's very difficult. But anyway, these papers are often cited and there is confusion based on them. And hopefully this will alleviate your confusion.